This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining our conversation tonight. I was thinking about this particular topic because people are always asking me this question: how do I stand out? What kind of things can I do in my interview prep that give me a little bit of an edge? And I ask that question as well. These days, I do not find myself in the interview room. I am coaching and advising and doing research around the best practices. And the best thing for me to do is when I'm working with various individuals and have a chance to meet students and professionals who've had a successful outcome, I ask the questions. What did you do? What do you think really made a difference? And so I'm going to share some of those things this evening. There are many things that we could talk about. I focused on a few that I've heard repeatedly. I've also thought about them in terms of their uniqueness and their benefit. And hopefully those will be a little bit connected to some things that maybe you already know about interviewing, but also perhaps putting a different take on it. As a way of introduction, I know some of you joining or listening have had a chance to meet me in the past, attend one of my prior webinars. But for those of you listening for the first time, my name is Pam Schilling, and I run a company called Archer Career. We are career thought leaders, career coaches, having transitioned from our careers in business and hiring managers. And some of the work that we're doing now that we're very excited about is bringing technology to job seekers in helping with job search, execution, and preparation. There's a lot of different aspects to my background that I try to summarize and bring to these conversations. Some of it is because of the success I had as a professional interviewing for a number of different jobs in strategy consulting roles in tech companies. And then there's also a few things that I learned by way of not doing all the right things. So having some of that reflective ability is important to me. For those of you that are here, you're obviously learning and staying connected to some of the events that we're having. I'm enjoying these. I hope you all are finding them beneficial. It's nice to be able to get a broad and diverse group of people together who have questions around similar topics. We anticipate continuing these conversations weekly or every other week through probably the fall at least. And for those of you that are thinking about a consulting or a corporate interview path, I have a couple of topics coming up that will focus specifically on case interviews. One of them will be a guest appearance that I have on a webinar through Career Contessa, which is coming up next Wednesday, the 12th. And then the following week, I'm going to talk about case interviews as well, but specifically outside of the consulting arena, more of the corporate environment, because that is something that is ever more popular. The other thing that I want to share with all of you, and I've mentioned this a few times, one of our big initiatives is a couple of software applications. The one that's coming out relatively soon, we're in our 5-week countdown, is our case preparation application. If that's of interest to you, please go to our website, include your name, select that you attended this webinar, and we're going to give everyone a chance to essentially demo our software for about a month. We appreciate that because it gives us a lot of feedback. And so if that's of interest, take advantage of that. And then finally, if you find yourself in a place where you want to have an actual one-on-one conversation, again, come to our website. I'm doing a number of coaching sessions and a very small fee. We're donating that fee as a way to give back to the community and to be able to engage with individuals that want some guidance, but normally may not engage a career coach for a variety of reasons, sometimes cost. So if that's of interest, take advantage of those, and we welcome that. Back then to our topic tonight. again, as I mentioned, I thought about some of the things that different students, different clients of mine have done. And I think it's worth explaining some of the professionals that I work with. So the variety of my clients is pretty expansive. And I think that that's important because some of these organizations, particularly consulting firms, they are often focused on a narrow group of individuals. Many times, some of these organizations, they're targeting individuals that are in full-time MBA programs. If you look at the rankings, they're typically the top 10, 15 MBA programs. And I think in some ways, that process facilitates being able to interview successfully with those kinds of selective hiring organizations. Although I will be honest, not all the full-time MBAs find this to be the easiest route either, but certainly there are some advantages. So I work with very few full-time MBAs. I do some case training, I do a few other things, but most of my clients are in a different circumstance, either a part-time MBA program, working often at a non-target school, or experienced professionals who aren't part of an academic program, maybe in the past, but not at present. So these circumstances create some extra hurdles for getting one, interviews and two, offers from some of these selective organizations. And then even if you go out to whatever organization it might be, many times they're hiring one person. And if you are a part of a pool of candidates that maybe there are 5 or 6 people, you still have to stand out and be that one unique individual that catches the eye of the hiring manager. What does that mean? It means that if you can do small things to differentiate yourself, those small things can have a huge ROI, return on investment, which in this case, investment is typically your time. And I'm often reminded of the experiences of individuals that I worked with that really were able to get themselves an opportunity that was quite a long shot, or that maybe the circumstances worked against them. An example of this, I did have a chance to get to know a student when I was in the career office at Chicago Booth. So this was a time when I spent 2 years coaching the full-time MBAs about a decade ago. And I remember this one student because I'd gotten to know her very well. She was very interested in sustainable energy, more of the startup or early stage companies. And she came back from a trip out to California and we were having a conversation. And she told me that she wasn't really sure that she was going to get the internship opportunity. She went out there, they had 6 or 7 other MBAs. It was her from Chicago Booth, and everybody else was from Harvard Business School. Come to find out, the CEO was from Harvard Business School. Now, in the MBA world, in most academic settings, there's a lot of alumni loyalty. And to be honest, the Harvard alumni are among the tightest. So I think she knew from just those circumstances that odds were not in her favor. Surprise, surprise, the moral, probably no true surprise, but the ending of the story was she actually received the internship offer. And when the CEO called her to share that excitement, I think what she relayed to me was he really had a hard time making the job offer to me, but he said he couldn't help it because it was so clear that I had done my homework, that I had done research on the company, and that made all the difference. And I knew so many more facts about the industry, so many more movements that the company had made in comparison to the other candidates. And so that's just an example of the kinds of things that, perhaps it took a few hours of research, but it enabled her to really differentiate and stand out under conditions that, frankly, most candidates would not. These are the kinds of things that we're aiming for. So I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think make a difference in the world of consulting. Now, these can be extrapolated to other types of jobs inside a company, whether it's a product management job, an operations job, a finance job. It could be if you're a teacher, it could be as an entrepreneur, it could be as a nurse, any type of role, as an attorney, et cetera, et cetera. Because many times you have to be able to converse, understand the issues. So here's my top 5 list. So the first thing is to build cases out of articles from the Wall Street Journal. And as a business person, picking up, and I'm speaking mostly to business professionals, although I think this applies in other domains, other career paths as well, but specifically for business people. So the Wall Street Journal tells you about all the different things that companies, organizations, governments, et cetera, are doing well, and then also not so well. And many times for interviews, you need to demonstrate business acumen, domain knowledge. There is a wealth of information in the Wall Street Journal, and I use the Wall Street Journal myself to build cases for the various mock interviews and other things that we do. This may seem really obvious. However, I have seen few people take this to the maximum degree of impact. And I'll give you an example of a client of mine who gave me this tip. This is directly from this individual. And one of the things that he shared with me was that every morning he made a cup of coffee, he sat down at wherever and read 4 to 5 articles in the Wall Street Journal. And every one of them, he would read the article once, he would build kind of a case structure out of it, or he would brainstorm different ideas on how to solve the problems, or maybe there was something in it that he could create a market sizing question. If he had 5 minutes with the CEO, what might be a couple of questions that he would want to ask? And he treated all those articles like mini cases. And over the course of about 3 months, imagine doing this 4 or 5 days a week. How much content, how much industry and market and business awareness that you build simply by doing this, 15, 20, 30 minutes a day. And I remember after he received his offer, which was from the Boston Consulting Group, one of the things that he said to me was, Pam, every client of yours, please tell them to do this. This was such an impactful part of my prep process. So how do you do this? Well, first, having a subscription to the Wall Street Journal is beneficial, obviously. And what I like to do is go into the business section of the Wall Street Journal, look by industry. I happen to pull up the auto and transportation industry and find an article that looks like there's something interesting from a broad business standpoint. So as I was perusing this today, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this idea of charging stations, that could be very interesting. So what if I was a consultant and I had to work with General Motors to figure out where they were going to expand the placement of 2,700 electric vehicle chargers? How would I organize a project like that? Where would I place them? What would my criteria be? What concerns would I have? Oh, it says here there's an undisclosed amount of money that they would spend. Well, why don't I estimate how much that would cost? Equipment, implementation, how could I go research that? And this is a fantastic activity to just make your neurological processes for not only the consulting job, but any interview that you're preparing for. If you happen to be looking at a healthcare company, maybe you read some of the healthcare articles and stay very current on the industry. But if you are in fact looking at consulting specific jobs, treat every one of these articles like it's a case. If you get really, really good at it and you have a chance to practice with your peers, then one of the best things to do is craft this into a case and then deliver it to one of your colleagues. So I love that. And it's not time intensive. It should be really interesting and fun. And it gives you a huge amount of breadth of knowledge. Okay, so that's tip number one, casing from the Wall Street Journal, taken by quote, by experience from my colleague Matthew, who went to work for the Boston Consulting Group. Tip number two then, this is also a study area. So we call this studying the facts. And in fact, facts we call factoids. It's just a fun way to express these. This is not about memorization. This is about creating reference information that you may have to draw upon. For those of you that have done some work around the consulting job already, you are very aware that you have to do a case interview. For those of you that might just be exploring this career path, you have to do a case interview, which means solving a problem live for 45 minutes in front of your interviewer. In corporate interviews, the case might be a little less than 45 minutes, but it still requires you to think through things. There is not an expectation that you have a giant encyclopedia in your brain. However, it is good to have certain references. One of the consulting firms, EY Parthenon, they regularly use market sizing in their case interview. And market sizing is the kind of thing that if you have some knowledge of factoids, which is typically populations, maybe demographics, maybe certain buying characteristics, you give yourself a little more confidence. It's a bit like when my kids who are just learning to swim, they're okay swimmers, but there's times that I'll put them in the pool with floaties on, right? Floaties just gives them a little bit more confidence, okay? That's what having some knowledge of these facts or factoids gives you. It's interesting, they're easy to study, and their application is vast. So I have a couple other colleagues of mine who, both of them also ended up at the Boston Consulting Group. This was something they would quiz each other on, and it became a challenge. And I don't know, some people have certain ways that they entertain themselves. They would get together on an evening with some type of adult beverage, and then they would challenge each other on factoids. Now, specifically, what do I mean by factoids? So let me show you a few. These are easy to access, powerful, and they don't require you memorizing precise numbers. I have a schedule. Let me see if I can increase the size of this just a little bit to make it easier. I have a schedule that I've built, and this is all around populations. And I start with extra large cities, and I get a little bit smaller. And what I do is, rather than trying to memorize the exact population of a city, which seems to me very hard, what I do is I put them in categories like t-shirts. So New York has a double X large t-shirt. And so if I ever got a case that had a market sizing or some other problem that I had to quantify and it involved New York City, I would know that New York City wears an extra large t-shirt. And that is a population of about 10 to 20 million. Doesn't matter what the exact number is because this is all estimation. If I got a case that involved Phoenix, Arizona, they are a medium-sized t-shirt. Okay, and then those are the US cities. And if you have things that are outside the US, you can put a couple anchoring cities in there. And this way, you don't have to memorize the populations of every city around the world. So I have no idea what the population of Vancouver, Canada is. I have been to Vancouver. I think it's kind of a medium-sized city. I know that Toronto is probably ish somewhere close to Chicago, but I know Vancouver's much smaller. So I would just put a medium-sized t-shirt on them. And then we can apply this to states, US states. We can apply this to different countries. So they have different population scales, but the extra small to double X large still applies. And if you quiz yourself on this periodically, you get really good at just kind of remembering and kind of feeling your way through things. This is a great activity. And over a period of time, if you spend 5 minutes a day quizzing yourself, 10 minutes a day quizzing yourself, the impact of that is really high. And when you come to the interview and you get a market sizing question and you have to estimate the insurance market in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and you say to yourself, I don't know the population of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but I'm feeling like it's a small city, maybe even extra small. So I'm going to make this assumption, and then I'm going to tell the interviewer, and then it doesn't look like you're totally guessing. It looks like you actually have a framework. There are other things that you can easily study and having them categorized. So I have 5 categories of factoids. I have populations, I have demographics, I have consumer behavior, I have measures, and then I have money. And the reason that I have those 5 categories is that over time, the patterns of the quantitative aspects of cases kind of fall into those groups. So I'm going to focus. So demographics might be things like by age. Knowing that can be really valuable. And then there's just some other things, the urban population, household members, income levels, marriage rates, unfortunately, divorce rates, and maybe percentage of college students. So the nice thing is if you had, for example, a notebook with these categories, and then you proactively put a few of these things together, and then if you get a case or you get a question and you don't know that information, you don't have that factoid at your disposal, what you go do is a little bit of research and then you add it. And this occurs throughout your preparation period. But I'm really good, so I'm not a great memorizer. I have more of a visual memory and a conceptual memory, but I am oddly not great at memorizing facts. I wasn't a great test taker, standardized test taker. There's just, that's not my thing. But I'm really good at remembering groups of things. And I'm really good at when I summarize things, because I have a little bit of this visual memory, the act of summarizing it helps me remember those things. And then it's not about precision, it's about closeness. So if you had put this together in your studies, and then you got a case and you were trying to remember the demographics of more or less the teenage group, you're like, oh, I can't remember if it's 15 or 20%, it wouldn't matter as long as you're close, because the interviewer is happy that you're in the right range, especially when you're doing something like market sizing. So those are demographics, and then we have things like consumer behavior, which might be different things related to, well, not behaviors right now, but behaviors that are most prominent in our society. So in normal times, unfortunately, during COVID, these are not as normal, but it's things like how many people travel by air, domestically, internationally, how many cars are sold in a given year, what about cable TV subscriptions, you know, those sorts of things. So I put those together just kind of based on everyday things. And if I had a case and it had some aspect and I didn't know what it was, I'd add it to my notes. Then I have a measurement. This goes back to a couple of people that I worked with. I had an individual I worked with who was formerly a 5th grade math teacher. One of the things that was really interesting about her background was that, so math is pretty quantitative, but she was really, really good at teaching math. But in terms of working mental math and working it quickly, she was finding that to be extremely challenging. And so over the course of the summer, what she did was built herself a list like this of the metric conversions and the math conversions. And then she created some shortcuts for these so that she didn't have to memorize all these numbers. So that's one of the other tips with some of these factoids is you don't want to memorize them because these numbers are pretty minuscule. So if you notice in my column here, I have the actual values, and then I've created a shortcut value that I try to remember. And then one of the nice things about an activity like this is you could put them on flashcards, index cards, handwrite them. And then maybe you're waiting, 10 minutes between phone calls. I won't suggest that you do this when you're on a business Zoom call, but you could just pull out your flashcards if you have 10 or 15 minutes. And you start to develop those mental muscles. Same thing for the monetary category. So different kind of broad macroeconomic numbers, and then also some particular financial market numbers. So again, these are the kinds of things that you could put on a flashcard and periodically run through. If you're working with partners, if you've got a spouse or some other significant other, roommate who's helping you prepare, these are great things to just do. And then, by the way, when you read the Wall Street Journal, these two activities are reinforcing. Okay. Just so you all know, when I'm working with individuals, I do not give them these kinds of schedules. I believe, and this is maybe the professor in me, I believe there's benefit in actually developing this yourself by way of doing the research, writing it down. Each person has a cognition process that's a little bit unique. The way that I summarize data might not work for you, but the flashcard process is probably one of the best and the simplest, and it's cheap. You can go to just about any Walgreens and get yourself a set of index cards. The key is to have frequent repetition and review and not make it a memorization. Also think about when you're working on different business problems, particularly cases, how you can apply some of these factoids. Okay. So that's factoids. Don't memorize, but study. Okay. All right. My third tip, and this may come across as one of the most obvious things, but it is to take and apply feedback, really. And this is a comment that was made to me by one of my clients who received a job offer. This individual happened to get a couple of job offers. The one that he accepted was with Alex Partners. So now with his job offer in hand, many students came to him to ask if they could practice a case or run through stories. And what he relayed to me one day that he found a bit frustrating is that maybe he met with someone a month ago, gave him some feedback, and then had a second follow-up meeting, and the same issue persisted. So persistence is a wonderful thing. Persistence is not a good thing when it's an issue with your interview prep. And so we talked about this a little bit, and I think it's something that is a little bit tricky to give you specifics on how to. And it may also kind of come across like what does it mean? People give me feedback all the time. Of course I apply it. But the question is, are you really applying it? And I think that what I want to convey to you is that sometimes in your practice, in order to get better, you have to do things terrible. You have to take risks in the way that you're doing your work. This could mean maybe it's the conclusion of the case at the very end. And maybe one of the things that you receive feedback on is that it took you too much time to put your notes together, that you should shorten that amount of time. So the feedback, the way you could apply it is practice some conclusions and take no time. Just speak spontaneously, don't write things down, mess it up a little bit, but get yourself comfortable doing that. Why do I suggest this? Well, there's actually a learning process that we have to go through sometimes. In order to get things right, we have to unlearn the way that we're doing things wrong. And the best way to unlearn it is just to completely go 180 degrees in the opposite direction and to do it completely wrong and build our skills back up. I have learned this a few times and I consistently still learn it. I've always been a reasonably decent public speaker. I can't say why. It just was one of those things that was oddball in my skill set. But a few years back, I had to do a TED Talk. I didn't have to do, I was invited to. And that style of speaking is completely different. And I started with my normal approach, and a bunch of the coaches said, you have to throw all of that away. And I had to completely rebuild the way that I gave a presentation. And it was very powerful and made a significant difference in so many things that I do, whether it's webinars like this, whether it's teaching, whether it's guest speaking, which I do occasionally. But I know, and this is why this is so hard, I know that it was very scary the first couple of coaching sessions I had following my initial presentation. I would apply this to the experience interview, not just the case. There may be things that you could do to better walk through your resume. Making small tweaks sometimes won't make you better. Occasionally, you have to completely retool and try something different. What that all comes down to is that the feedback that you get is important, but finding ways to apply it and make a significant difference in the way you approach your interview is crucial. And I'll tell you the last reason why this is so important. When you there's two reasons I'm going to give you, actually. So the first one is in the interview process. In consulting interviews, it is likely that you will have a chance to engage either by way of networking or some pre-interview support, coaching, mentoring with the consultants at the firm. And you may get a chance to do that on a couple of occasions. The consultants themselves, if you met with the same person twice, that individual will listen and see if you've made progress since your first meeting. And the reason for that is my second point. When you get into this job, the amount of feedback that you get is intense, extensive, probably some people would say overwhelming. If you are given feedback about an analysis you did and you don't apply it for the next iteration, you will run into issues. Consulting is a very feedback heavy job. And I think about it. I am an ex-consultant. The co-founder of our company and our CTO, she is an ex-consultant. We've had interns last summer, this summer. We had an intern in the past who did not take feedback. Now we have a couple interns. We give them a lot of feedback. And we could substantially see the difference in how they apply our feedback and behave, perform, do work differently and quickly. So these things, again, are all integrated. The snapshot of how you do this is if, for example, you're practicing case interviews, you should always record your case. Especially right now, if you all are doing this stuff virtually, you have access to recording devices. You can also do it on your phone, and then watch an old case and watch a new case and see if you can notice your difference. Okay. I see in the chat there was a question about what interns did well and what they did not. I mean, I'll give you a very specific example. We like project plans. Just one of our things. My colleague and I both come from consulting firms that were exceptional at project management. We both worked for a firm that's now part of PwC. She was at Accenture. They do exceptional project management. And so we like project plans. When you are a college student, you might have a syllabus, but you've probably never created a project plan. And we ask our interns, here's your assignment, here's your project, create your project plan with some deadlines and review that with us. We can definitely see the difference. And it's not about excellence, it's about effort when you're an intern and you're learning. So one of our interns last summer just couldn't do it. Tried lots of feedback. We have two interns this summer. One of them probably doesn't excel at it, but is developing the skill. The other person turned their own kind of checklist skills that they use as a student into project plan skills and has done an exceptional job. So we as the managers are trying to give that type of feedback, right? I do the same thing in my coaching, is give feedback on specific areas. And then if I meet with you again, I want to see that. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And you should want to see it as well, because if you don't continue to progress applying some of that feedback, it's going to leave you a little bit short at the interview stage. Okay. So that's number 3. These are going to get more fun and interesting. My tip number 4 is about connecting and connections. I am just going to give my point of view that I believe in the present environment that we are in, making connections with people is ever more important. It's also difficult because it's forcing people to learn to build relationships in ways that are a bit awkward. I think it's very natural that people don't love networking by phone or by video. People will say, oh gosh, I'm a much better in-person person, et cetera, et cetera. If I go back to what I would have told all of you a year ago, I would make this same statement. Make connections more deeply than you think you need to. And I have a much greater appreciation for this on the other side of my consulting career. But when I think back to the interview stage that I was in, I think that there's some things that I did extremely well. And I see it in some of the other individuals who have done really well in their own interview processes as well. So what does it mean to make connections more deeply? You're meeting a consultant at a firm that you have interest in working for. What does that mean in terms of making a connection? Well, certainly you have to have some base level credibility. You need to establish that you can do the job, that you have the kind of credentials that are typical of the people that are hired by that firm. But then it starts to go deeper. And I think the one area that I can highlight for you is to every time you meet someone at that firm, say to yourself, I will potentially work on a project with that person. That person is going to rely on me. And also, that person is going to be scared out of their mind that I will collapse in a crisis or I can't get the job done. Because the consulting job has a lot of stress to it. And you're on a consulting engagement with 4 or 5 people, you have a mountain of work to do that can almost seem insurmountable. This is making it sound super fun, right? And things go wrong. Things go a little bit sideways sometimes. If I'm on that engagement, will the engagement manager know that they can trust me to get things done? So how do you do that throughout your interview process? Well, when you talk to people, you get to know them. You ask them about the challenges that they have with their current client. You know, are there any rough spots that you all are dealing with? There's an acknowledgement that the job isn't just sexy, but the job is also difficult. That's why it's such a high paying job, by the way. There's also, I think, a way that you can get to know people more deeply, not to the degree of a friendship, because at the interview stage, that might be pushing the boundary a bit much, but having an understanding of who the person is. And I think about that when I was recruiting with a couple of different consulting firms throughout my career and just talking to the people and learning, you know, what are your hobbies and what are your interests and what are the things that you do on clients when you're not just working. and learning about the cultural norms and the environment and what do people have kind of in their backgrounds that enable them to do the job successfully and also sometimes create challenges. You know, nowadays, if you all are doing video, you can see people's office spaces. So there's also presently a slight change in the dynamic. Now, it doesn't mean that you should ask 83 questions about the pictures on somebody's wall, but you could, you could potentially ask the person, did you have to redecorate your home office now for the stay at home, or, and try to make a little bit of light about it. And then generally people will talk about things in their background. So I think the point is to remember that the people that you're speaking to are human. They are people with interest in lives and careers and challenges just like everybody else. And if you only stay on the surface of a conversation, you're not going to get to know that person or what makes that person really special, or makes them unique, or makes them fun, or makes them interesting. And so feeling confident to ask a few questions that just push the boundaries outside of the professional limits, you have to have some confidence to do that. You have to take the bull by the horns to be able to do that. Okay. But the summary comes back for this whole tip number 4 is that I'm going to hire you both to get the job done on my team, where I need to trust that you can work at the highest standards, potentially under a crisis situation. And if I am stuck with you, stuck in the nicest possible way, on an airplane at an airport, or on a project that's really, really difficult, or it's a 2-week due diligence and we're going to work together 19 hours a day, I do want to make sure that you're the type of individual that I would enjoy conversing with. So that also means, ask people about hobbies and books they read and what TV shows they're watching and what do they like to cook, and, have they had some really interesting takeout in this, kind of weird shutdown world. That is how you'll make those connections and get a little bit deeper. Okay, so the last, number 5, my tip. I encourage you to prepare physically. Many people focus on the interview prep, which is the content. Absolutely, you have to focus on that. But you also need to take into consideration that interviews are physically taxing. And whether it's because you're sitting for a couple of hours, if you have back-to-back interviews, whether it's because the activity of your brain makes your body kind of sweat, whether it's the adrenaline rushing because of the nerves of the interview setting. There's so many reasons why this is valuable. What does it mean? Whatever you like to do, and within capabilities, of course, different people have different physical situations. Find a way to combine some physical activity with interview prep. I had been known, I'm going to admit, I don't do this as much as I should these days, but in my prior days, I would do interview prep on a treadmill. So I would come home from work, it might be 7, 8 o'clock. I might have been in the interview process with a company, and I'd get on the treadmill, and I wouldn't walk at a super fast pace, but I would walk fast enough to kind of get my heartbeat up a little bit, my breathing a little bit heavier, and then I would run through interview questions. I might do market sizing problems. And sometimes, I had a laptop sitting in front of me. Sometimes I'm just kind of running it through in my head. There are two benefits of doing this. One, it's time efficient. Isn't that great? Number two, you are conditioning yourself to handle the physical stress and load of the interview setting. And you're going to potentially be a little bit nervous, and that's going to create a little bit of adrenaline, kind of, get your heart racing. If you've learned how to talk through that through your interview prep, that is hugely beneficial. Yes, thank you, Hua, for that comment. You can pull up YouTube and watch videos. But I'm encouraging, I love that. But on top of it, I'm actually encouraging certain types of activities where you're going to speak out loud. Walk up the stairs, get on a treadmill, ride a bike. I mean, do things that aren't going to injure you. And the act of speaking is great. Also, if you're someone who likes other things such as yoga, it's kind of nice to have quiet time, and maybe practice a mantra that builds confidence about the interview process, right? There's many, many different ways to behave in these circumstances. Whenever I'm working with individuals, and certainly I'm not doing this in person right now, but we do it on the video. When I was gathering with clients of mine at my office building has an open lobby, and there's a stairwell that goes between the two floors. And so we would meet at my office. I would stand at the top of the stairs. I'm the coach, remember? And I would have my client start at the bottom, start speaking their resume walkthrough, walk up to the top of the stairs, and like 2 half flights of stairs, and get that, and then do it down the stairs, and do that 3 or 4 times. And it works really, really well, and it puts you in a different mindset. These are fun things, I think, also that help you, that establish this mind-body connection. And although that may sound a bit quirky, I've found so many people that have been able to apply some of those techniques, and it really makes a difference. The thing that I try to aspire to when I'm coaching individuals is that the process of preparing has this really interesting balance of intensity but calm. And one of the ways that we do that is through kind of mind-body activities, which can be physical workout. So you're intense, you're assertive about what you're doing, you're building confidence. Those things then allow you to say, I'm going to be ready for my interview. I'm going to be ready for my interview. The opposite of this is a little bit of the scramble situation. It's a bit like a couple days a week when my kids are leaving the house, and we're trying to grab a shoe and a t-shirt and a mask, and they're not all in their backpack. That's the scramble situation. I don't want you to be in the scramble situation. I'd rather have you be in that kind of focused, intense, but calm. And these things, especially this physical activity, helps to bring some of that together. So I'm going to make a couple more comments, and then I've got a couple questions from the registration, but I'll take some questions from all of you, either by the chat or live. So just a couple more things with all of these. As you are thinking about your interview preparation, and some of you may be thinking about it, some of you may be in the throes of it, there are so many things to do. I am greatly appreciative of that. I mean, I have at my desk a set of stickies. I think I've got 10 things on my sticky that were actually supposed to be done yesterday. I've also got a bunch of things with my family that need to get done. That's just very normal. I absolutely appreciate it. What I've learned, though, through some of the feedback and discussions with my clients is that some of these can be broken down into very small tasks. But the small things can have a huge impact because in the world of what do all the job seekers do, sometimes they don't focus on the small things. And these are the kinds of things that if you find 15 or 20 minutes a day or every other day, the cumulative impact can be really huge. So back to my connecting deeply. Here's an example of a 5-minute activity. So we were talking a little bit earlier, I think, Kevin, about the deep dish pizza. So let's say, for example, that I'm the consultant. Kevin is interested in working for my firm. We've had this conversation about deep dish pizza. When Kevin sends me a thank you note from our conversation, and Kevin, please don't necessarily do this, although if you do it, I'm not going to complain. But Kevin might send me a thank you note, and in it, maybe he includes a link to his favorite deep dish pizza recipe. And the message might say, you know, hey, Pam, I really appreciated our networking conversation today. Thanks for sharing some things about your current client. Seems really interesting. Sounds like you've got a couple of alignment issues that you're tackling. Good luck with that. By the way, you mentioned that you're thinking about making a homemade deep dish pizza. I thought I'd share my favorite recipe. If you find that of interest, I hope you enjoy making it. That's what your email says. It maybe took you 5 minutes to put the link. You're going to send that thank you note anyway. You go out, you research that recipe, or maybe you've got it handy and you add that link. Odds are I might not look at it if I'm really busy. But if I do look at it, I might be like, that is super cool. And then, oh, thank you, Kevin, I appreciate it. But then, maybe the next time we talk, I might say to you, by the way, thanks for sharing that recipe. I made it. My family loved it. That was great. And now we're having a very different type of conversation. Okay. So that's one of those helps with the connection. It's a little thing. It doesn't take a lot of time. And it's not disingenuous. It's part of the relationship building process. Okay. All right. I am very happy to take a couple of questions. If you all want to take yourself off mute, if you've got another question, please put it in the chat. I'll seed the questions while you all are thinking a little bit. So one of the questions is how to stand out during the personal experience and fit interview. I would say there are two things that make you stand out. This is outside of the case. One is having a story that is well aligned to the question asked, that you did something impactful. Thus, it puts you at the center of the story. The second thing is that you have delivered the story so many times in your practice that you speak to it with passion and enthusiasm. That's kind of an interesting thing because some people will say that a lot of practice makes you seem really rehearsed, but what you do is you rehearse the unnaturalness out. And if you can do that, you will be golden. Other questions that I got in advance. One of them goes back to my point about the connections. This question was, is networking critical to landing an interview or a job offer? My answer is always yes. I will explain it this way. There are definitely firms who make interview selections, I will say, almost purely based on your resume. But once you get in the interview, if you have done your networking, you've done your research, you've understood where you fit in the firm, what excites you about the firm, the cultural dimensions, what areas of work you might be interested in, you are so much better off. The other thing is, if you've done networking in advance, you have a much better understanding of the kind of things that the firms look for in their resume reviews. Where I get a little bit challenged is when people think that networking is the process of persuading someone to grant me an interview or to help me in some way in getting the job offer. What I regularly say, emphatically so, is that networking is a research process. It is the means by which you gather better information to make you a very strong candidate. So if I go talk to 3 current Bain consultants and they tell me certain pieces of information about their background that they highlighted, and then I have a chance to say to them, you know, I have a couple of these things in my background that I think would be beneficial. They might say, you know, look, those 2 for sure, put those front and center. You would build that into your resume. And then the resume is one of the considerations for the interview. I think I say all that to emphasize that many times the networking process is somewhat misunderstood. It seems to people it's kind of this, you know, frankly, let me schmooze, let me make people like me, if they like me, et cetera, et cetera. That's not really what the process is for. It's really to help you gather information that then you can deploy at your application materials, and then once you're in the interview in that stage. And when you get to the point of the interview and the firm says to you, why do you want to work for Alex Partners? Why do you want to work for EY? Why do you want to work for Roland Berger? Et cetera, you can say, there's a couple reasons. And when I had a chance to talk to your consultant, Dave, and I also spoke to Sarah, what they relayed were these things, and that really resonated with me. Those points go back to making those connections more deeply. And sometimes if you've talked to a person more than once, which is a deeper connection, you get better information. Another question that I received in the registration was about group interviews. How often are group interviews used for consulting positions? Historically, present times excluded, a couple of firms routinely used group interviews. Deloitte has been known to use group interviews. Kearney has been known to use group interviews. Sometimes you might have more than one interviewer, if you call that a group interview. It's not uncommon. It's not common, but it's not uncommon. I would say that if you find yourself interviewing in the next 3 to 4 months, it might be more one-on-one, but I wouldn't count on it. And I think it is something to be aware of. So my company, we did an interview process for our interns. We did a group interview. We actually had them do a case, no surprise. And 3 or 4 of us, they were presenting to 3 or 4 of the people on my team during their interview. That's also common in the corporate setting. Think about, do some research. You can always find out a little bit of information on Glassdoor. You can also ask whatever company that you're interviewing with. It's not a taboo subject. You should be as well prepared as possible. And then it goes back to, probably this point 4 again, making sure that you're connecting. And by connecting, plural, because if you've got a group interview, you're going to have to speak to multiple people. So keeping that in mind. Any question from those of you that are dialed in right now?
Hey, Pam, Carl here. I just have a quick question. Hi, Pam. So how many companies should one have in a target list?
It's a great question. It will vary depending on your interest. If you are, so let's take consulting as an example. I've worked with people who have focused on 4 firms, or I've worked with a couple people who have focused on 2 firms. Some of that was the factor of their background and an assessment that there were only 2 firms that provided a professional opportunity better than the one that was kind of the current state. So sometimes for people in robust corporate jobs, private equity positions, sometimes investment banking, sometimes corporate development, sometimes corporate strategy, people will be extremely focused in looking at consulting because the position that you're in is excellent. On the other hand, I think if you're somewhat trying to make a career transition, and I don't love the word transition because it has some implications, it sort of has some interpretations. But if you're going from one field, say a technical field or something narrower into consulting, you may want to have more firms on that list. Is that 8 firms? Is it 10 firms? I've seen some people look at 12 firms. I would offer some guidance. The more firms that you have on your target list, the more networking you need to do. The harder it is to navigate this process, and you have to write 10 or 12 cover letters. On the flip side, there's some economies of scale in consulting. I would then say that you want to do some research. What are the firms that have strong competencies in the areas that you're interested in? What are the traditional hiring patterns of those firms? Are you at a target school? Are you in a target program? Do you have a background that kind of aligns well to their specific hiring circumstances? So that will help you narrow your list. So, if I had to land on a number, I like people to have 8 or 10 consulting firms. If you're attacking consulting kind of holistically. I think you can manage that. I think it's difficult to try to recruit with firms that you don't have a lot of interest in because you're going to go through the motion. And then the final factor that I would lay out in terms of your target list is if you're going to do anything in parallel in the corporate environment. So these days, many of my clients, working professionals, students, will maybe look at consulting plus product management, or consulting plus business operations, or consulting plus finance in a company, or corporate development, or corporate strategy. Every company you add, there's an X factor, because the companies, you have to work at them very uniquely. There's a lot of company research that has to be done. You have to network a little bit differently because they tend to not have as many networking events. And some of this excludes, right, the present environment, because networking right now is a little bit unclear how much firm activity. But if you have 8 consulting firms and you have maybe 5 or 6 companies, that can be a bit overwhelming. I've seen people do it. I knew somebody who did it last fall. It worked out okay, but it ends up, being, it requires you to do a lot of heavy lifting on your prep, and also a lot of choreography in terms of your schedule and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, Cal. So, I mean, that's a long answer, but I think if you put it into these categories, there's kind of the narrow, there's the broad, and then there's consulting plus corporate. And
Thanks, Pam.
right? So think about it in that way. Great question.
Yeah, as you were saying, I was concentrating in both consulting and product management, but someone suggested me it's better to just concentrate on one, because your preparation, it needs to be focused at some point.
Yeah.
What do you say for that? Like, should someone, like, if there's 2 months of time before we start interviewing, should I be focused, or can I concentrate on these both job profiles?
It's a good question. If we were talking at a different time, at a different place, I would give you a different response. In an environment where there's robust, normal hiring, I think interviewing for consulting is kind of an all-in, and then maybe 1 or 2 key product management roles. And if you're doing, so if you're a part of a university, you're a student, you have an on-campus process, there's probably a couple of companies that you'd be very excited about from a product management standpoint that come through that process. But I often speak to people about recruiting in waves. You just have to decide what wave comes first. And usually it has to be consulting because of the timing. And then maybe 1 or 2 product management positions. And then for reference, outside of kind of a on-campus recruiting cycle, a lot of product management positions come, and they're fantastic, because product management sometimes is a role where they'll look at a brand new MBA and an experienced MBA, so they're hiring to need of the job. They're not hiring a cohort. With that said, in our present environment, I think you have to assess over the next 2 to 4 to 6 months, perhaps, who are the organizations that are hiring, and if they are both in consulting and product management, I think you can go 1 of 2 directions. And this is, I'm not going to give you this precise answer, but this is how I think about it strategically. You could go all in on consulting But I think there's a reality that consulting recruiting might be limited because the consulting firms have made full-time offers to all of their interns. It's just a function of that. So if you go all into consulting, you have to calibrate your expectations. And, you know, who are you going to target? And are the firms that you're interested in the firms that are hiring? So there's kind of this dating game, if you will. On the product management side, you know, product management is kind of up and down right now. A lot of companies in tech are doing fantastic. Some companies in tech are doing terrible. Will they come in on campus? Don't know. You could probably be opportunistic about that. And then the question is, what's the level of effort that you put into your prep? So, you know, there's not an answer. I think you have to, what I would try to do is assess yourself and be very realistic. If you have the strongest chance getting a consulting role, I might put more efforts there. If you have a super strong chance of getting a product management role, I might put my efforts there. And in a year, 18 months, 2 years, you can always recruit for consulting as an experienced hire. The firms, you know, when the economy starts to come back, they'll be hiring experienced hires, and a little bit of time in product management is incremental. Okay. So back to your question, I think, without knowing, you know, your background specifically, I tend to suggest that you think about where the elements of your background line up the best. Where's the best alignment? Where are other people going to see your background and value it? Because right now, the hiring that's going on, people who are pivoting a little bit, that's a much harder hiring process because there's just more risk and I have fewer people to hire, et cetera, right? So it's also kind of a long way of answering your question, but hopefully gives you some guidance on how to prioritize your own personal activities.
This is very helpful. As you're speaking, I'm getting more questions as a follow-up. It's okay. This is the last question. So,
fire away.
So if that's a strategy I'm going to follow, where I go into the field that suits me the best right now, and like later look at consulting in 18 months' time, would you advise not to interview with McKinsey or BCG now and get rejected, and just wait 18 months and try give it another shot? Because I'm pivoting, and as you were saying, I'm realizing it might be a tough ask for me to get into consulting at this time.
I mean, I think there's some benefits in having interview experience because what you don't know is part of the enemy in this process. I would also say, you know, to calibrate a little bit, some of the, if I model this period like the last recession, some of the firms are just not going to interview, or they're going to interview very, very few people. If you're good enough to get an interview with a selective consulting firm, I'd go. And I think you have to be as prepared for product management. I mean, the things that carry you forward both need really good experience stories. Both you're going to have some form of the case. But if you get that interview, it's because you've done a lot of hard work and they think that you have a good background. So it's sort of an interesting like chicken and egg problem. My bet is you won't get the interview if you're not a good fit. So you may never have to face that question. But yes, I would much rather interview and have that experience. And I can also say I've worked with many people who've had more than one experience going through the interview process. It depends how that first round goes. If it's a complete disaster, they will not reconsider you, period. But if it's one of those circumstances where they can see your potential and just maybe weren't quite at a readiness stage, they'll tell you, come back and talk to us. I mean, I know an individual right now who's an engagement manager at McKinsey, and his first effort as an experienced hire did not make it through the first round. He was given some guidance to go back and do some prep. And 4 months later, he interviewed and then got his offer. And that's not the only individual that I know that that's happened to. The key is to be reasonably ready. And if you want to be ready, ready is ready. If you're going to be ready for product management, you're like 70, 80% ready for consulting. If you're ready for consulting, you're 70, 80% ready for product management. But I think that getting the interview is potentially harder right now than it would normally be, if that makes any sense.
Thanks, Pam.
It's a good question. It's a good question. Other questions that have popped up? Excellent. Well, I will maybe just offer a couple of closing comments. I think that the interview process, the preparation that it takes to get there, it's a marathon. It's long, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of cross training, endurance, persistence. A lot of things set you back. I was on the phone earlier today with a client of mine who had one interview and it did not go very well, unfortunately. It was kind of a weird circumstance, so we were talking a little bit about that. And, you know, that's a really hard thing to experience. But it's worth it. And if your professional attention is turned towards finding a new opportunity, I think there's two sides of this coin that you want to balance. One is there is a persistence. It could take a little bit of time. It could take multiple interviews. That's just the nature of it. But asking yourself some of these things, how do I do little things that make a difference? How do I find 15 or 20 minutes a day that just allow me to do a couple more things that keep pushing me forward? And that will help a lot. The flip side of this is sending out dozens and dozens and dozens of applications and interviewing again and again and again. There is a diminishing degree of productivity and effectiveness. More and more, there's probably something that is slightly missing. And so if you find yourself kind of, you know, going at things, having some fits and starts, having things not break through, it's worthwhile to step back and say to yourself, what in the world am I missing here? And take a critical look at that. And that's where that point about, really thinking about the feedback that you're being given. It is difficult because interviewers are not able to give feedback. Some interviewers will not at all because of HR reasons. Some interviewers won't because they don't want to tell you the cold, hard truth. Sometimes it has nothing to do with your interview performance. It's some other factor, okay? But if you put your game plan together and you sink your teeth into some of these best practices and do this with energy and optimism, even in the most difficult times, people are being hired. So take that as a source of, inspiration. Do what you guys want to do. I think, being a part of these conversations definitely shows that you have a degree of motivation. And I hope, again, this conversation was beneficial to everyone. And with that, I'm going to say good night and hope to have you join another one of the conversations coming up. Thanks so much, everybody.